We are back. You have no rights, no privacy, no freedom during a national crisis, according to the U.S. government. And this is now being debated before the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court of the land. This is also a fulfillment of end-time Bible prophecies. And as a result, this matter has to be addressed. Greetings, salutations. Welcome to this midday power surge. This is your spiritual oasis on this pilgrim journey. I'm your host, Andrew Henriquez. In addition to the aforementioned points, I'm also going to be exposing the final crisis that will precede the mark of the beast and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Let's get right into it. It's now trending. There it is, friends. We are told, based on end-time prophecy, just before the second coming of Christ, the mark of the beast must be enforced. That's chapter 14 of Revelation, verse 9 through verse 16. And the mark of the beast begins in the United States of America. It begins right here. That means there has to be a transition. Chapter 13 of Revelation, verse 11 through verse 18, speaks of the beast with two horns like a lamb. This is apostate Protestant America, but it will speak as a dragon. Is that transitioning happening before our very eyes? That's exactly what we're going to cover at this point. Meter of the beast. Here it is. Supreme Court skeptical that the Biden administration violated First Amendment by encouraging social media censorship. That's March 18th, 2024. Judge orders the Biden officials to limit contact with social media companies, and that was last year, 2023. This is what set the stage for this matter to be brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. Listen, Senator Josh Hawley blasts the Biden administration for coercing big tech to censor Americans' free speech. Here it is.
The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals just ruled in a case, Missouri versus Biden. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It's going to go down, I think, as a landmark case in the worst possible way in First Amendment law, because what the Court of Appeals found is that the White House, not just the federal government, but the White House actively coerced every major social media platform in America. Let me say that again. Every major social media platform in America to ban speech that the White House did not like.
How is this a fulfillment of end-time Bible prophecies? You stay tuned. Watch this, my friends. Listen, about social media companies being private, and yet they can moderate content.
Social media sites have a First Amendment right to curate and edit their sites according to their own curatorial and editorial philosophies and policies. That is a right that others in their position have, whether they be art curators or parade organizers.
It sounds good. Vivek Ramaswamy counters that argument.
Vivek Ramaswamy, great to see you again, Vivek. Thanks for being here. So is the judge right here? Was this the biggest attack against free speech in our entire history?
The judge is absolutely right. And David, I was actually writing about this starting in January 2021, when along with my former Yale law professor, we were the first people to actually advance this legal theory. It was dismissed at the time, where what we said was if the government actors are using private companies to do through the back door what the government could not do through the front door, then those private companies are actually bound by the First Amendment. That bucks conventional wisdom because the First Amendment usually applies to the government. But
And here is Justice Alito. He asked the question, is content moderation by big tech, meter of the beast, a euphemism for censorship? And the response was, only if the government is doing it and not private social media platforms.
Is it anything more than a euphemism for censorship? I want to just ask you this. If somebody in 1917 was prosecuted and thrown in jail for opposing U.S. participation in World War I, was that content moderation?
So if the government's doing it, then content moderation might be a euphemism for censorship. If a private party is doing it, content moderation is a euphemism for editorial discretion. And there's a fundamental difference between the two.
All right? And listen to Vivek Ramaswamy now, actually telling us the social media platforms, big tech, are now the arms of the state. As a result, they are bound by the First Amendment. They should not censor speech because a government is using them. Here it is.
But it turns out if they're turning private companies into their pawns to be able to censor speech that's protected by the First Amendment, then that's still bound by the Constitution as well. This is the first landmark case in which a federal judge has come down on the side of that legal theory that I advanced 2 years ago, over 2.5 years ago, actually. And at that point, I think that this is a major milestone for the protection of First Amendment freedoms of every American.
So this is a crisis that's under disguise. People think the censorship primarily is coming from big tech. It's actually coming from the government. Hear this.
Because the most dangerous First Amendment threat is not even the one that comes directly from the government, but one that comes from the government and is disguised to make you think that it was coming from a private company.
Well, and Vivek, they're really two.
And where are we going with this? We're going to see, if you simply stay tuned, a time is going to come, God's remnant, faithful messengers, preachers, teachers will not be able publicly to present the seventh-day Sabbath when the calamities continue and the crises, and Sunday is enforced as a law of the land for rest and worship under the penalty of death. This is exactly where we're going. And as a result, this presentation is a life and death one. Here is Justice Jackson. Whatever the government views as a threat during a crisis must be censored, must be removed. Pawns, right? Pawns. I wonder whose pawns they are. Listen, Justice Jackson.
Exchanged between the White House and other federal officials and Facebook in particular, but also some of the other platforms.
Alito.
And I see that the White House and federal officials are repeatedly saying that Facebook and the federal government should be partners. We're on the same team. Officials are demanding answers. I want an answer. I want it right away. When they're unhappy, they curse them out.
Mercy.
There are regular meetings. There is constant pestering of Facebook and some of the other platforms, and they want to have regular meetings. And they suggest, they suggest rules that should be applied, and why don't you tell us everything that you're going to do so we can help you and we can look at.
So here we have Justice Samuel Alito. Next, I'll come to Jackson. You can see what's happening here. He's actually stating the government is working in tandem with big tech. Clear. And he says the government is actually cursing out big tech when they are slow to respond to their inquiries. They want to control the content on their platform. Do you see a transformation going on, fulfilling Revelation 13 and verse number 11? That this beast with two horns like a lamb will speak as a dragon. This is roaring. This is anger, wrath. Justice Jackson, hear what she says now. They should remove and ban content that they deem as a threat. Who? The government in a crisis.
And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country, and you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot manifest itself in the government encouraging or even pressuring platforms to take down harmful information. So can you help me? Because I'm really worried about that, because you've got the First Amendment operating in an environment of threatening circumstances from the government's perspective, and you're saying
From the government's perspective, remove that content. In actuality, the stage is set for the fulfillment of Revelation 13. Justice Jackson went on to say, the First Amendment is hamstringing the government during a crisis. Do you know what hamstringing means? Watch this.
Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods.
So in other words, during a crisis, we must do away with the freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment. And if you knock over one pillar, all the other pillars, rights, fall because they all stand together or they fall together. What spirit is this? To overthrow our rights and freedoms and privacies? All they need is a crisis. And this is what is now being debated before SCOTUS. And the tyrant, even a chief tyrant, is watching closely. They are about to rule on this summer, 2024. These are the arguments being brought before SCOTUS on yesterday, March 18th. And the question is, do you not think that they will bring on more crises? Because now they know it's the law of the land, that during a crisis or crises, your rights, your privacy, your freedoms are now repudiated, then they'll manufacture more crises. And how does a nation speak? She speaks to her legislative and judicial branches of government. That's a fulfillment of Revelation 13. And what the other lawyers are saying is, in a crisis, the government should not take away our rights. You know, friends, let me break it down. There's several examples I could share, but here is one. Do you know when people are sick and they must undergo a surgery and they go to the hospital, they go to the clinic, and the surgeon steps in the room and he speaks with the sick, let's say sick and dying. The surgeon may persuade, but he's going to give options. You can elect to take the surgery, or if you don't, here are the consequences. He gives options. Why? Because the sick has rights. The sick has privacy. It doesn't matter if it's a crisis. What is a more crisis than life and death? As long as there's time, we have options, but they're saying that during a crisis, you have no rights. That's the spirit of the dragon. Now, conversely, if somebody were to meet in an accident, this person is unconscious, brought to the ER, the clinic, the hospital, right? And after being observed, surgery is necessary. The person is unconscious. As a result, they can move forward to preserve life. However, what if that person who met in the accident unconscious, what if next of kin was informed? A spouse was informed. A child was informed. Parent was informed. Then the hospital must first consult with parent, spouse, grown child, next of kin, before they can move forward. In a crisis, your rights still remain. Do you know why? Your rights come from God, and there are no exceptions. Am I clear? Is the trumpet distinct today? Let's continue. Here is Justice Jackson. She goes on to say that she rejects the option that government can post its own speech, post its own narrative in a crisis without suppressing, censoring, and removing counter-narratives during a crisis. She flatly rejects that, categorically rejects that. Listen.
I mean, what would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done. And
that's not going to get it done. We must remove speech. All right. Here is Justice Jackson stating, there are certain crises where the government can abridge First Amendment rights. Certain crises, watch this.
But whether or not the government can do this is something I took up with Mr. Fletcher, depends on the application of our First Amendment jurisprudence, and there may be circumstances in which the government could prohibit certain speech on the internet or otherwise.
The stage is set for the fulfillment of Revelation chapter 13. Here is Justice Alito yesterday, March 18th. He says, the context was actually the inoculation of the people during the pest-19 pandemic. Here's the exchange with the lawyer and Justice Alito.
Partners, we're on the same team. Do you think that the print media regards themselves as being on the same team as the federal government, partners with the federal government?
So potentially in the context of an effort to get Americans vaccinated during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And I really think that piece of context, it doesn't change the First Amendment principles, but it's relevant to how they apply here. And I think it's important to understand that at this time, this was a time when thousands of Americans were still dying every week, and there was a hope that getting everyone vaccinated could stop the pandemic. And there was a
hope. 3 points. There was a hope that getting more people, most Americans, inoculated would stymie the pandemic. A hope. What have we learned since May 11th, 2023? So in a pandemic of pestilence, what happens? It says your rights are now abridged. All they need is a crisis. So what is going to be that final crisis? I'll get to it. Friends, he just stated, number 3, that millions, thousands of people were dying in America every week. I'm going to play 2 clips, and you tell me, how is it that these 2 statements are allowed on big tech platform, allowed on social media, and yet other narratives, statements were suppressed? Listen again. Maybe you missed it.
Partners, we're on the same team. Do you think that the print media regards themselves as being on the same team as the federal government, partners with the federal government?
So potentially in the context of an effort to get Americans vaccinated during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And I really think that piece of context, it doesn't change the First Amendment principles, but it's relevant to how they apply here. And I think it's important to understand that at this time, this was a time when thousands of Americans were still dying every week, and there was a hope that getting everyone vaccinated could stop the pandemic. And there was
How many people were dying? Thousands each week were dying. SpongeBob, talk to us.
A few moments later.
Not moments. What about months? SpongeBob, speak to us.
Many months later.
Here is Mr. Floodgates. Mr. Floodgates went on to state, listen, there was a benefit to millions of people dying during the pestilence 19 pandemic. This is allowed on Media of the Beast. Here he is.
But the pandemic, which you would have thought, wow, global health research, to talking about health, being ready for the next pandemic, when you've got millions of deaths, isn't that, it's sad, it's tragic, but isn't at least there a benefit that health is on the agenda?
What? There's a benefit to millions of people dying so health can be on the agenda? How many people were sacrificed then? How many people? Let's stay right here. Remember, 1 moment later or months later, here's Bill Gates again. There was asked a question, which is a more urgent threat? A pestilence pandemic or climate change. The man said, a pandemic can be natural or it can be intentional. That's what he said. Watch this. Listen. Look at the dates for these clips here, friends. The dates of them on top. Clip 2. Move on.
But
enough. Clip 2. Here it is.
Is the threat of the next pandemic as urgent now as the threat from climate change?
Well, they're very different. You know, climate change just gets worse every year as long as you continue emissions. A pandemic, we're likely to go a fair period of time without either a naturally or intentionally caused pandemic. But when it does strike, we saw tens of millions of lives and tens of trillions of dollars. Fortunately, the cost...
You caught it? Did you hear it? Preachers. Maybe they missed it. And notice he's a smooth operator. Silky smooth words. He just put that statement in the midst of a flowery of other words. And if you're not listening attentively, you'll miss it. Here he is again.
A pandemic, we're likely to go a fair period of time without either a naturally or intentionally caused pandemic. But when it does strike, we saw tens of millions of lives and...
In other words, a time is going to come. How many individuals have their platforms removed because they were pointing out the tyrants? They were saying this thing was done intentionally. You see my point? How many folks lost their license as a result? It's very similar to when God sent the prophet Nathan to address David. 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 7. Thou art the man. We're now seeing a time where God's people cannot identify the tyrants that are promoting tyranny. Let that sink in. That it is a benefit to see millions of people dying. But you have no rights. You must shut up. Silence, you slaves. You see my point? The stage is set for the fulfillment of chapter 13 of Revelation. Here it is, friends. Calamities are going to come. Great controversy, page 589. They will bring disease and disaster until populous cities, millions of people are reduced to ruin and desolation. They will impart to the air a deadly taint, and thousands will perish by the pestilence. Let that sink in. And then they're working in the laboratories, just as it was in the days of Job, in Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2. The signs of the last days are here for those who want to see it. Now, this is Justice Jackson. She went on to say, in certain situations, the government can coerce the conscience. Now, once I played this clip, the real question is, what are some of those situations? And what will be the final situation? That's the point. That's our quest for today. Here she is.
In certain situations, the government can actually require that speech be suppressed if there's a compelling interest, right?
It can, Your Honor, and I guess what I would say is that the courts below never got to strict scrutiny because the government never raised this. This has never been litigated. The question in this case is whether at the front end, the government itself has undertaken
action. Is the coercion, is the state action, right? That's the question in this case.
Yeah. And I would urge the...
They can coerce the fulfillment of Revelation 13, verse 15. They can cause, they can force, coerce the conscience. Friends, is freedom of speech, is freedom of the press the only principles enshrined in the First Amendment? No. Take a look at this, friends. It says the right for worship and religion. What about to peaceably assemble? What about to petition the government for a redress of grievances? Protest. If they can, and since they can, remove two of those freedoms during a crisis, what about worship? That's it. The mark of the beast. That's where we're going right now. This is what's happening in Canada. Here it is.
What is the proper role for the feds? There's no question. I'm not up for debate on the value of journalism, but to what extent does government get involved here, and what are you prepared to do?
Since we have covered speech, let's get to the protest, the right to petition the government for redress during a crisis, grievances.
Fighting back. Protests, public protests are an important part of making sure we're getting messages out there, but using protests to demand changes to public policy is something that I think is worrisome.
Okay. So here we have the Prime Minister of Canada saying that, yes, we have a highly functioning democracy and they have the right and freedom to protest. However, if those protests are used to demand change in government policy, then no.
The small fringe minority who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing. Do not represent the views of Canadians who know that following the science and stepping up to protect each other is the best way to continue to ensure our freedoms, our rights, our values as a country.
So that is mob rule. Mob rule. Clip 2.
As of today, a bank or other financial service provider will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order.
If you are involved in this protest, we will actively look to identify you and follow up with financial sanctions and criminal charges.
Banks have already started to freeze the accounts of people involved in the protests.
Please get out. Immediately get out. Intimidating people in a church during the Passover.
Church.
Unbelievable.
Church.
Growing up under communist dictatorships, I have been warning Canadians that that's what's coming. I could smell it. I could see it at every corner. We will not put up with this anymore. We are fighting back.
It's clear. Has the point been made? It's not only speech and press, but religion. At this point, I'm going to post an actual poll question. Kim in the chat writes, only cowards that can't defend their point try to silence those who tell the truth. Wicked people! Exclamation sign. That's it, friends. It's clear. And that's why we are addressing this. The stage is set for the fulfillment of the mark of the beast being enforced. And we won't be able to protest against the mark of the beast on social media. And we won't be able to present the truth publicly. It will not happen. The stage is set. That's why we are addressing this today. Here is your poll question. Once the preachers let me know it is posted. Friends, here it is. According to the book of Revelation, which specific crisis leads to false worship legislation or else face death? You have 4 options. Option A, wars. Option B, famines. Option C, pestilences. Option D, calamities. Based on the book of Revelation, which specific crisis will lead to the enforcement of false worship? Yes, by law, of course. Or face the death penalty. Remember, they just told us that certain crises will cause the government to abridge, repudiate your rights. All of it. So what is the final crisis based on end time prophecy? I'll give you a few more seconds while I give you 2 clips. I'll come back for the results. Here is Senator Josh Hawley. Hear what he says.
What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about speech on the COVID-19 pandemic, speech on the 2022 congressional elections, speech related to mask mandates, speech related to vaccines. What did the White House do? Well, over a period of years, They met with on a regular basis the leaders of social media companies and demanded that the speech they did not like be taken down.
Clip 2. Stay right there.
They further demanded that these same social media companies amplify the White House's speech. Amazing. So take down all of this speech that we don't like, amplify our own speech. Unbelievable. What kind of speech are we talking about?
All right, friends. At this point, let's end the poll and get the results. Based on the prophecies, which specific crisis will lead to the enactment by law false worship? And those who refuse will experience and counter the death penalty. All right, so we have 45% chose option D, calamities, and that answer is correct. Write down Revelation 13, verse 13 through verse 15. The Bible speaks of fire descending. The fire will deceive, the Bible says, and cause all in America to form an image to the beast. And verse 15 says, he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause, as force, cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Fire descending from heaven. Then verse 16, then verse 17, you won't be able to buy or sell. It all begins with the fire descending. What does that fire represent? There's several applications. One, it points to calamities. In the book of Job, put down Job chapter 1, verse 12 and verse 16. The fire was brought down by Satan, but Job's servant said it was God. Blame God when it was Satan. Last days, Satan working through his human agents, but they will say it's God doing it. That's verse 12 and verse 16. And James chapter 5, verse 7 through verse 11, the Bible says the account of Job is an end time account just before the second coming of Christ. Note these quotations, these statements. In the book Great Controversy, page 576, Sunday became the law of the land through calamities. It's going to be repeated. Page 579, calamities will be the last crisis to bring on the mark of the beast. The Pope has already said so. It's going to be combating climate change that will force the nations to enforce Sunday as the day of worship. Just as we're told in the book Great Controversy, page 590, it is going to be calamities. We have Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House. Watch out, God will send judgments and chastisements upon America. Bring people back to church. We are experiencing declining of church attendance. This is SCOTUS now. U.S. Supreme Court says the government of America can enact Sunday worship. For what purpose? For health, for safety. Do you see that, my friends? And it doesn't violate, your amendment rights. It's right there, friends. From SCOTUS, it's already on the books. It's the final crisis. Now, at this juncture, look at this. Here is one my conservative base is really going to like. A constitutional amendment requiring folks to attend church on Sundays. What is that last crisis? It's going to be calamities. Friends, let's get back to the Bible as we close. In John chapter 11, do you know Christ's freedoms were stripped away from him in John chapter 11? And what caused this in John chapter 11? They said in verse 46 through verse 53 of John chapter 11, if we don't silence Jesus, that speech, if we don't get rid of him, even to kill him, we will lose our place and nation. A national crisis. We must kill this man. That's the Bible speaking. Also put down Acts chapter 4, verse 18 with the apostles. Verse 18 onward, did we not tell you not to speak these things? Not to speak in this man's name? Imagine when the Sunday law is enforced. Where will we find accommodation to preach against Sunday worship and to preach, exalt God's 7-day Sabbath? Maybe you missed it. Maybe you missed it. Remember, the pestilence 19 elixir was their solution to combat the pandemic. Anybody who spoke against it was censored, banned, deplatformed. You see my point? What is going to be the medicine, the remedy to combat calamities? It's going to be Sunday worship. You just saw the play. You just saw it. So those who preach against Sunday worship, you will not be accommodated on social media platforms. If you present the 7-day Sabbath based on the Bible, God's word, you will not be accommodated on social media. You'll be banned. You are a threat to our government stability, sustainability. That's it. So where must we begin? Number one, do all that we can now on social media before that day comes to fruition. Number two, house to house evangelism. That's it. The best form of evangelism. House to house, in the community, mountainside, in the valley, by the seaside, in the wilderness, rural evangelism, city evangelism, neighborhood evangelism, house to house. Read the statement in Testimonies for the Church, volume 9 and page 41. And on page 40, what do we need? Busy hands and active brains. Now it's time. I'm going to encourage you, if you were blessed by this presentation, to give this video a thumbs up, share it so we can awaken and prepare others with the 5 keys of survival. We're also streaming on other platforms. The links are in the description. By God's grace, I will see you tomorrow for Midday Power Surge at 12 noon Eastern. Remember, busy hands and active brains. The protest continues.